Welcome to the Mansfield Podcast, your guide to U.S.-Asia policy. I'm your host, Tim White, and on behalf of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation, thank you for joining us. Today, we're joined by Jordan Heiber, Vice President of International Digital Economy Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Jordan is a member of the 5th cohort of the Mansfield Foundation's U.S.-Japan Network for the Future, and was a Mansfield Fellow deployed to Japan in 2010-2011. Jordan spoke with us in March 2023 to discuss his path from U.S. government through the Japanese corporate sector in Washington, and now in advocacy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We also discussed key areas of cooperation between the United States and Japan on digital economy and trade. All right, Jordan, thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
So you're in a different place professionally than where you were when you started with the Network for the Future program. Can you fill us in on that transition?
Sure. So I'm currently with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. People often believe that that is a government agency or institution, but it is not. It is a trade association and the largest advocacy organization in the world. Prior to joining the Chamber, I spent 6 years with MUFG Bank and helped run their government affairs office out of Washington, D.C. And that's where I was when I started Network for the Future. And that experience, which spanned about 6 years at MUFG, also followed a decade in the U.S. government working on Asia and primarily Japan-focused foreign policy.
What is it that you're doing at the Chamber, and what's the connection to Japan?
Yeah, good question. So I'm part of the Chamber's Center for Global Regulatory Cooperation, which is perhaps a bit of a mouthful, but our team is focused on developing, promoting, and aligning regulatory policy in the digital economy, and doing so in international markets and on behalf of the business community and primarily the U.S. business community. When you think about the digital economy, perhaps it's both cliche and at the same time hard to fully wrap one's head around it, because at this point, in an interconnected global economy, everything really is part of the digital economy. And that covers concepts and ideas from data privacy to cybersecurity to artificial intelligence, content moderation on social media. And all of that is part of the team that I lead and what we're focused on in terms of promoting policies that reduce risk, but also allow for innovation across borders and in international markets. The Japan piece is just one piece of that portfolio, and coming from roles that were often, very Japan focused prior to joining the Chamber of Commerce, it's been both interesting for me to work on other regions or work within other regions outside of Japan and outside of Asia, but also to bring my Japan background into this role, because when you think of economies and countries that are part of that leading edge of digital transformation of the digital economy, Japan is certainly one that comes to mind.
People talk about digital transformation in this space quite a lot, and transformation can be a scary word. You've talked about the digital economy, and I think that's easier for people to wrap their heads around. But what are the transformations that we are seeing in the digital economy?
It's quite broad in the sense that there's really no aspect of the economy that hasn't been touched and isn't being touched by digital transformation. And you can think of it in the sense of sending an email and the number of countries and continents potentially that the data centers that email might bounce around before it ends up at its final destination. You can think of it in much more complicated ways, such as the AI revolution that is currently underway. In terms of the different chat GPT and other chatbots that are getting so much attention now. You can think of it as well in the financial services space, with cryptocurrency and digital financial trade. It really runs the gamut across the entire economy. It's not, often we think of this as something specific to large technology companies, but it is much more pervasive than that. It is much more, I don't know if important is the right word, but influential in terms of how it relates to really any company that's doing business across the internet, and especially any company that's engaged in any sort of business or commerce internationally.
So when you're talking about the US-Japan relationship, we're talking about two of the three largest economies in the world. So where do you see this cooperation between our two countries headed?
Yeah, so we have a lot of extensive cooperation across the US-Japan relationship in the digital space. Actually, next week is going to be the Internet Economy Dialogue, which is a bilateral dialogue between the US and Japan. It's taking place here in Washington, D.C. next week. It's something that the U.S. Chamber and our U.S.-Japan Business Council, which is the Japan-focused arm of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, that is deeply involved in. That particular dialogue has stretched back, I think, 13 years. I'm pretty sure this is the 13th year. The U.S. and Japan also cooperate in numerous bilateral fora, whether you're looking at the OECD, APEC, G7, the IPEF negotiations that are currently ongoing and have a digital component. The breadth of the US-Japan digital relationship, I think, is about as wide as the overall US-Japan relationship and covers all aspects of it. Another key component being the US-Japan bilateral digital trade agreement that we concluded back in 2019. So it's really anchored by a number of different touch points across different areas of both the private sector, government to government ties, civil society, quite broad and quite deep.
So can you talk a little bit about why it's important that the United States and Japan act together on these digital transformation issues?
Sure. And I approach this maybe, I come from a more traditional trade background as an alum of USTR, the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, which takes the lead on trade negotiation. And in my trade days, we often talked about the spaghetti bowl trade policies and having various trade policies that are between different countries, between different regions that don't align and that complicate trade and make trade more expensive, that could potentially make trade more risky. And I think that we can draw an analogy from that to the digital trade component as well. And when you look at digital trade globally, different countries are putting forward their own regulatory policies, putting forward their own laws, and doing so across a range of aspects of the digital economy. So you have the EU with the GDPR in terms of privacy, which has been emulated in many countries around the world, but also altered in many countries around the world to satisfy their own domestic needs. You have similar variations in cybersecurity policy. You have emerging variations as policies are being developed in the AI space. And so from the US Chamber's perspective, and from where I sit, and especially looking at the US-Japan relationship, there's this tremendous value in trying to align these different regulatory approaches and in trying to do so in a way that allows businesses to be innovative, that allows them to stay on the cutting edge of whatever the next technology might be, but also does so in a way that reduces risk as we're dealing with emerging technologies. And again, we see it a lot in the AI space, wanting to make sure that these technologies are explored in advance in a way that protects consumers, that protects economies, that protects, societies at large. And so finding that middle ground where you are able to promote innovation, where you're able to protect consumers, where you're able to reduce risk is immensely important. And the US and Japan, I think, have a very key role to play in terms of putting forward that agenda on the global stage, where you have all of these different players, whether it's very large economies like Europe, which is very active in the regulatory space. Similarly with China, which is very active in terms of its own economic and digital policies. But even as you look down and creating a leadership role to emulate for smaller economies as well, to follow that principled approach to digital transformation.
What should we be looking for in the United States and Japan on those next steps in the digital transformation?
Yeah, I think there's a couple key things that are happening right now that merit paying attention to, and where US and Japanese leadership will be especially important. First, you have the US and Japan leading respective multilateral organizations this year, both of which are very involved in the digital economy and cooperation between countries across the digital economy. The US leading APEC this year, and Japan having the leadership role at the G7. So within both of those fora, you have this unique opportunity for the US and Japan to cooperate together across multiple multilateral fora during a year in which both are in leadership roles. key to, I think, Japan's leadership year in the G7 is its DFFT agenda, which is data free flow with trust. And this is something that Japan launched in 2019 and is something that Japan has made clear that they want to really push as part of their leadership of the G7 in 2023.
So Japan has a digital affairs minister, Konotaro, who is a familiar name to those of us watching the US-Japan relationship. Can you talk a little bit about where he is pushing for Japan to make improvements in the digital transformation?
Yeah, so I think Japan has a couple of priorities, and I'm less versed on its domestic goals than I am on its international goals. But in terms of the domestic goal, it's no secret that Japan is, even as we think of it as a very technologically advanced society, there's a lot of processes and procedures, and especially I think within the government and as the Japanese government communicates with its own population, that are still not quite caught up to the digital economy and transformation that we're talking about now. Paper being printed and hankoed and signed and transmitted by mail instead of much more simple processes that can be done over the internet. And I know that modernizing Japan's domestic system is a key priority for Minister Kono. In the international front, I think the biggest priority is this DFFT that I mentioned before. And this was again a priority launched by Japan in 2019, but something that has for the last several years sort of lacked meat on the bones, so to speak, in terms of actually moving beyond a concept or an idea that data should be able to flow across the borders, that consumers and companies should have trust that that data is safe, that it's getting from point A to point B as directly and safely as possible, but to actually put that into an actionable plan. And that's something that Minister Kono is really focusing on doing now.
So it's clear when you're looking at Japan, who is sort of the point person on these digital issues. They have a digital affairs minister. Who is it on the United States side the Chamber of Commerce is looking to? Is there a federal agency? Is there a House committee, maybe the Committee on Energy and Commerce? What are the institutions within the U.S. government that the Chamber is looking to for leadership on this?
Yeah, and I think you're actually raising what's perhaps, I don't know if it's uniquely American, but a challenge that we actually have in this space on the U.S. side. We don't have a comparable digital ministry, and I don't know that I would necessarily advocate for one, but it does mean that there isn't necessarily that go-to person or that go-to agency within the U.S. government for the range of digital economy issues that we face in the US, the same as countries are dealing with around the world. Similarly, we don't have a federal privacy law in the US. We don't have a number of these other laws that other countries have put in place or are putting in place, which again can make things more complicated on the US domestic side and a little bit more spread out in terms of who has responsibility. The State Department, I think to its credit, recently created a Bureau for Cybersecurity and Digital Policy, and that really aligns these issues within the State Department. And there are certainly bureaus or offices within other agencies that take the lead on digital policy issues, whether that's at the Department of Commerce, whether that's within the White House and the National Security Council. There's a team devoted to digital trade at USTR, but it certainly is a little bit more spread out on the US side, which means we don't have a Minister Kono necessarily that we can look to, or the agency that reports into him here in Washington when looking to advocate for our regulatory concerns, our approach here in the US.
I will point out that the House Energy and Commerce Committee has several members who are actively engaged in the U.S.-Japan relationship. Frank Pallone, the ranking member from the Democratic side, just participated in a Mansfield-led legislative exchange to Tokyo. I know that the Congressional Study Group on Japan has Diana DeGette and Larry Bouchon, who have been working to understand Japan better. So I'm hoping, at least on the congressional side, that we are developing expertise. We're looking at these issues. And thank you for pointing out the executive branch areas where we might see further U.S. leadership on this. Can you talk a little bit about the chamber and the role of the private sector in making sure that these rules are instituted and followed?
Sure. For the Chamber of Commerce and for my team within the Center for Global Regulatory Cooperation, my team works extremely closely across all of and especially the international councils and teams within the U.S. Chamber. And we have business councils and regional teams that are focused on key markets around the world. I mentioned the U.S.-Japan Business Council, but there are also business councils focused on Europe, focused on the UK, focused on Latin America and various countries within Latin America, Australia, really around the world, Southeast Asia. So my team works extremely closely with our colleagues and partners within those councils and within those regional offices to work on behalf of our members and advocate for their interests in these markets that I just laid out in responding to this question. We really press for in all of our engagements the need for regulators, the need for foreign governments as they're developing policies in the digital space to engage with private sector stakeholders, the ones who will be responsible for implementing or making actionable, these policies. So a lot of our engagement as it relates to foreign governments is really trying to ensure that the business community has a seat at the table. I mentioned the Internet Economy Dialogue, which is taking place next week here in Washington. It's bilateral between the US and Japan. It focuses on the broad range of issues that I mentioned, whether it's cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, cross-border data flows, data privacy. And that's, I think, one of these bilateral fora or bilateral opportunities where they have really successfully brought in stakeholder voices. Sometimes, whether it's in government to government engagement or just as individual governments are developing regulations, they do so without bringing stakeholders to the table. And that's where we really try to lean in and press and say, if you want this policy to be effective, if you want it to be implementable, if you want it to benefit your economy in the long term, then you need to have the experts at the table. And that's where we try to lean in.
Great. So we'll be looking out for that bilateral meeting in early March next week, as you said. We're keeping an eye on the G7 summit in Hiroshima in May. I know that there's also a April summit of the G7 digital ministers in, I think it's Gunma Prefecture. What is it that we're likely to see come out of that? And what, if any, of the digital agenda will we likely see at the full G7 Leaders Summit in Hiroshima?
Yeah, so I think the big question, at least as it relates to the G7 and Japan's goals, and I think it, to an extent, remains to be seen. I mentioned Minister Kono's, and we talked a little bit about his focus on making DFFT, data free flows with trust, actionable, bringing it from what's been a concept for the last few years and making it something that is actually tangible and that has true impact in the digital economy. And the way that Minister Kono has announced that he wants to do this is by creating a secretariat that will be focused on DFFT and have buy-in from the other G7 members. I think that's going to be a key focus, and I think Minister Kono has made it clear that that's going to be a focus of their April launch in Gunma Prefecture at this upcoming meeting. I think it's a really interesting idea, and my understanding is that the Japanese have been going around in the last few months and to lay the groundwork to get this launched. I think it's still unclear, where the rest of the G7 members are in terms of, I think that there is no discussion or disagreement on the goals of DFFT, but whether or not Japan can be successful in putting this secretariat together and getting that launch off the ground is still a bit an open question.
So it seems that in this relatively new stage of your career, you're very passionate about Japan and the US-Japan relationship. Can you talk a little bit about how you first became interested in Japan and the career path you've taken to this point?
How much time do we have?
We have as much time as you want, but I mean, I know that you're a Mansfield Fellow.
I'm happy to, and there are a few things I like to talk about more than my passion for Japan and how some of my earlier experiences really shaped my academic and professional path. But like many of my Japan-focused peers here in Washington and elsewhere, I got my start as a teacher in the JET program. I taught for 2 years just after university in Fukui Prefecture. And I went to Japan thinking it would be a brief blip between college and whatever my professional career might be after living in Japan for 2 years. and completely underestimated just how transformative that experience would be for me in terms of where I wanted to focus my attention in terms of academics, in terms of career. It really, almost all aspects of my life since living in Fukui. But I returned from Fukui after 2 years and ended up studying international affairs here in Washington, D.C. for grad school before heading into the State Department and working in the East Asia Affairs Bureau. I initially worked on Korea policy because I had had the experience of living in Japan in Fukui and then studying primarily Japan and China in grad school for my master's degree, and then completing the East Asia trifecta by focusing on Korea for my first 3 years in the US government in the State Department. But definitely missed my work with and in Japan, which was part of what motivated me to apply for and become a Mansfield Fellow, which also sort of directed me on my future career path because I came back from the Mansfield program and instead of returning to the Office of Korean Affairs, went to the Office of Japan Affairs where I worked for 2 years before going to USTR to lead our US-Japan trade negotiation efforts in the context of the TPP Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. So a long-winded answer, but Japan, I think, has continued to pop up in every aspect of my professional life ever since I lived in Fukui when I was 22 years old. And that's at this point more than 20 years ago. And even at times when I've perhaps tried to run away from Japan a little bit and experience new things, I've always come back to it. And even in this new role that I'm in at the U.S. Chamber, even though it's not a specific Japan-focused role, I'm always looking for ways where the U.S. and Japan can cooperate in the digital space, given the amount of overlap, the amount of commonalities that we have as it relates to the digital economy and how relevant it is to our broader bilateral relationship.
So you alluded to your participation in the Mansfield Fellowship program that you spent 2 years in. You're one of the few people who have done both the Mansfield Fellowship program and this US-Japan Network for the Future. Can you talk a little bit about what you derived from that network experience and how that shaped your thinking of Japan?
Absolutely. I think both experiences were incredible, and I'm fortunate and grateful to the foundation that I was able to take part in both. So I'll say that at the outset. The Network for the Future experience was unique in that it really allowed me, as somebody who has operated inside the DC sphere for my career, the only places I've worked in my post-collegiate career, I think, have really been Washington, D.C. and Japan. And so in looking at the U.S.-Japan relationship and spending so much time in Washington, which I don't want to undermine how important the relationships are here and how much gets done in Washington to advocate for and advance the U.S.-Japan relationship, there's still so much that takes place outside of D.C. And I think one of the huge assets of the network, and I think one of the huge assets to my own participation in the network, the assets to me, was to gain exposure to practitioners from Japan and from the US and academics from Japan and from the US that operate in worlds that don't revolve around Washington, D.C. or Tokyo the way mine does now or did when I was focused on US-Japan policy and government.
Great. All right, Jordan, thank you very much for joining us for this conversation today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to our conversation with Jordan Heiber of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Join us next time for a discussion with Dr. Catherine Goldfarb on family connections and child welfare policies in Japan. This season of the Mansfield podcast is made possible with support from the Japan Foundation. Special thanks to Nick Velez for editing support. Music is courtesy of Laura Schwartz and Bellwether Bayou. Thank you, and we hope you'll join us again soon.